والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليك يا رسول الله، صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله، يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة ويا عبرة كل مؤمن ومؤمنة، يا ليتنا فيا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال تعالى في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا يستضعف طائفة منهم يذبح أبناءهم ويستحيي نساءهم إنه كان من المفسدين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have all heard the saying, history repeats itself. And for this reason, you find many, many verses in the Quran reminding us of the experiences of past nations. Because human beings have a tendency to repeat the mistakes of the past. One of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us of the stories and the experiences of past communities, especially Bani Israel, it's because Allah Azza wa Jal is addressing the Muslim community and saying to them, make sure you do not repeat the same mistakes as that religious community. What's interesting is that when you reflect on the Quran, the Zionists of today, they take pride in calling themselves the children of Israel. But the problem is that many of them have failed to learn the vital lessons from the trials and tribulations of their ancestors. The children of Israel endured immense persecution under Pharaoh. They suffered greatly. They were exploited. They were denigrated. They were dehumanized. And the irony of ironies is that instead of learning from that experience, instead of upholding the principles of justice and equity and having respect for human life because of what they endured, instead of becoming a people that supports the madhlumeen because they themselves were madhlumeen at one time, the irony is that the once oppressed has become the oppressor. Neglecting the ethical imperatives that are etched in their own history. If you examine the modern state of Israel today, which is run by Zionists who claim to belong to this rich religious heritage, who often speak about the suffering of their people. What's interesting is that instead of taking lessons from Musa, they created a state that mirrors the policies of Pharaoh. And in tonight's lecture, what I'd like to demonstrate, I'll give you examples of how the modern state of Israel is essentially a contemporary state of Pharaoh. Now, if you look at the Quran, what does the Quran tell us about the Pharaoni model of governance? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He highlights one characteristic of the brutal regime of Pharaoh. The first thing that we find in the government of Pharaoh is the mass killing of civilians, especially innocent children. The Quran tells us that Pharaoh implemented an official policy whereby any Hebrew male infant that is born is to be immediately executed. Hundreds, if not thousands, of babies were slaughtered immediately after birth. Hence, the Quran tells us, and all of this was done in an attempt to control and to intimidate the Hebrews that lived in ancient Egypt. It was a mechanism of control. And he did this because there was always this paranoia that these people will overthrow my empire. So the Quran tells us, إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُم. He used to slaughter their children. And the Quran uses the verb يُذَبِّحُ, which is a present tense verb, which means that this is not just something that happened, once or twice. It was an ongoing policy. Hebrew children in ancient Egypt were being slaughtered before the birth of Musa. And even when Musa returned after spending a decade in Midian, the killing machine of Pharaoh continued. And children, innocent people, were slaughtered. Now, if you take this, you see that the same merciless policy exists in modern day Israel. And I'll give you some specific examples. One thing that we see about the Zionist state is that even though it claims to be the most moral military in the world, they call themselves the most moral military in the world. They have the most sophisticated weapons that have mind-boggling precision. However, whenever they use their weapons, they seem to disproportionately kill civilians and children. So either your weapons are not sophisticated or you're actually targeting civilians and children. Since October of last year until today, the death toll in Palestine is approaching 40,000. 40,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. The estimates say that 15 to 20,000 are children. 15 to 20,000. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that perhaps within this time span, the modern state of Israel has killed more innocent children than Pharaoh did. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it's possible. Now, usually when we speak about what's happening now in Gaza, people like to begin on October 7th, as if the story begins there. And what's happening now with the killing of innocent children is something that is an anomaly in the way that Israel deals with Palestinians. I'll give you two examples to demonstrate that this is a regime that specializes in the killing of innocent people, especially children. In 2008 and 2009, there was a military campaign called Operation Cast Lead. On December 27th, 2008, until January 18th, 2009, the Israeli military conducted a 22-day offensive where they attacked Gaza. We think Gaza was just... They attacked Gaza in 2008 and 2009. 22-day military campaign. In 22 days, they killed 1,400 Palestinians. And the statistics show, human rights organizations, they indicate that 82% were innocent civilians. 82%. This is in 2008 and 2009. In 2014, the Israeli military undertook another military operation called Operation Protective Edge. It's very interesting the language that they use. They refer to their military as the Israeli Defense Force. It's just defense. We're just defending ourselves. But we know that according to international law, an occupying force is not in a defensive position. Even the way that they name their military operations is a form of propaganda. Operation Protective Edge. What do they mean by Protective Edge? They conducted a 51-day military operation. Again, in Gaza, and in 51 days, they killed 2,257 Palestinians. 551 among them were children. Imagine. In less than 2 months, 551 children were slaughtered. To us, these are just numbers. But each child has a mother. Each child has a father, has siblings. When you kill one child, what do you do to this family? You shatter them for life. So the first similarity between modern day Israel and the regime of Pharaoh is the mass killing of innocent people, especially the killing of children. Instead of being protectors of children, protectors of the innocent, instead of learning from their history, no. They learned the wrong lessons. They treated Pharaoh as if Pharaoh is their prophet and Musa has nothing to do with them. The second similarity between Pharaoh's regime and the state of Israel is the subjugation of people based on ethnicity. If we go back to ayah number 4 of Surah Al-Qasas, إِنَّ فِرْعَوْنَ عَلَى فِي الْأَرْضِ وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا. He divided his people. The age-old strategy of divide and conquer. He divided his people. يَسْتَضْعِفُ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ. He subjugated one group in his nation. And that is who? The Hebrews. You see, in Egyptian society under Pharaoh, the Coptic, the Egyptian was privileged. The Egyptian was registered as a full human being. Whereas the Hebrew was second, third, fourth, fifth class citizen. And this is why in the Quran you see that when Musa comes out of his palace, what happens? What happens is that he finds an Egyptian assaulting a Hebrew, and he comes to his aid. That was not an isolated incident. That was just another day in ancient Egypt, where you have Hebrews abused, persecuted, beaten brutally in public. And it's not against the law. It's not a high crime to kill a Hebrew in ancient Egypt, but it's a high crime to kill an Egyptian. In fact, even if you are Musa, who is the crown prince, who is the adopted son of Pharaoh, you're not forgiven for that. So what does Pharaoh do? He treats them as subhuman. They don't register as full human beings. He exploits them for labor. His entire economy is built off of their backs. They are relegated to live in the worst of conditions. They don't live with the rest of society. They have their own living quarters. They are subjugated because of their ethnicity. Now, when you take this and you see what happens in Israel, it's the same exact policy. Since the inception of Israel, there are over 65 laws that discriminate against Palestinians on the basis of their ethnicity. And I'll just give you a few examples. Number one, in 1960, Israel introduced a law called the right to acquire and lease land. You know, brothers and sisters, 93% of the land in Israel is public land, meaning it's either owned by the Jewish National Fund, by the State of Israel, or by the Development Authority. And it is against the law for this land to be sold to a Palestinian. It can only rotate between these three entities. They're not allowed to own land in those areas. So Palestinians in Israel are actually blocked from leasing about 80% of the land that is controlled by the state. So because of their ethnicity, because of their identity, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. It's okay. So this is one example of this discrimination based on ethnicity. A second example is in 1950, there was a law that was introduced called the right to return. The right to return. They also introduced a law called the absentees property law. The absentees property law. What is the absentees property law? It means that if you are absent, we get to confiscate your land. So the law stated that any Palestinian refugee who was expelled after November 29th, 1947, they are considered absentees with respect to their land. In 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly removed from their land. And after they were removed, the state of Israel looked at all of these apartments and these homes and these orchards, and they say, oh, they're absent. They're not there anymore. So the state does what? They confiscate the land. And what do? Simultaneously, the law of return says what? If you are a Jew who lives in any part of the world, you can come back and we will give you land. You can live in Manhattan. As long as you're a Jew, you can come and we'll give you land. But if you're a Palestinian, sorry, you're absent, we confiscate your land. All because of what? Because the Israeli is registered as fully human and the Palestinian is subhuman. You don't have rights. No. This is an inherent right for the Jew, and it's something that we don't give to you. Another example is the right to residency. The right to residency. Palestinians who have permanent residence in places like Jerusalem, what you find is that their residency is considered a revocable privilege. It's not an inherent right. Which means that Palestinians have to constantly prove to the state that I live here. I live here. They have to prove that, for example, Jerusalem is the center of my life. Because if you travel and you're absent for an extended period, your residency might get revoked. But the Jew can go for months and years, and you still come back, and you have the right to return. And what you find is since 1967, over 15,000 Palestinians from East Jerusalem, they have had their residency revoked. They were permanent residents, but the state of Israel decided that you're absent or you can't really prove that this place is your actual main residence. And what's heartbreaking, my dear brothers and sisters, is that in March 2018, Israel passed another law allowing the interior minister to revoke the residency rights of any Palestinian that he deems to be disloyal to the state of Israel. Can you imagine? If he just decides that you're not very loyal to Israel, maybe you shed a tear for your ancestors who were expelled over half a century ago. You're not loyal, we cancel your residency. Can you imagine living under these conditions? Number 4, the right to family life. The ban on family unification. What does this law state? If an Israeli marries someone from the occupied territories, you are not allowed to live together. You're not allowed to live together. They do not allow families that are comprised of one spouse who's an Israeli and another spouse who lives in occupied territories. They cannot live under the same roof. And number 5, these are all examples of how Palestinians are discriminated against in the same way that the Hebrews were discriminated against in ancient Egypt. Number 5 is the right to commemorate the Nakba. We know, as I said, in 1948, there were armed forces that were sent into Palestine, trained by the British government, and they forcibly expelled over 750,000 Palestinians. You can even see the pictures online. And what's happened in the past few months, it is exactly like the Nakba of 1948, if not even worse. So what does this law state? In 2011, the Israeli government introduces the Nakba law. Do you know what the Nakba law states? It says that the Minister of Finance reserves the right to withhold funding from any organization that commemorates the Nakba. Imagine. 1948, you need to celebrate the establishment of Israel. If you cry for your ancestors, you will lose funding for your organization. Can you imagine that? And this is supposed to be the country that is the beacon of democracy. So the first 2 similarities between the Pharaoh regime and the modern state of Israel is the mass killing of innocent people, especially children. Number 2, the subjugation and the discrimination of people based on ethnicity. Number 3 is the arrogance of both regimes. If you look at Pharaoh, Pharaoh felt that he was untouchable. Pharaoh felt that he was above the law. Pharaoh believed that he was the law. Inna Fir'auna ala fil ard. In another ayah, what does he say? He says to his people that I don't know of any other gods but me. And then he says, if there are other gods, أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. I am your highest Lord. Pharaoh felt that he was above all. There was a sense of invincibility that he had. Similarly, the state of Israel also feels and exhibits this sense of invincibility, that they are above the law, they are above international law, they are above God's law, they're above any law, they are the law. Why do they feel this way? Because there are certain things that bolster their sense of invincibility. Their military capabilities, their advanced technology. This sense of being unassailable is reinforced by the fact that they have superpowers who are their allies. So what this does is that because they feel that they are above the law and they are untouchable, they continue to expand their settlements, even though it's in violation of international law. No, to them, international law is for everybody else. It's for these poor Gentiles. Yeah, you guys follow the international law. We are a different category of people. We don't have to respect international law. In fact, not only are we going to expand our settlements, even though it violates international law. In the West Bank, we will continue to build. We will continue with our genocide, even though the entire world is pointing the finger and we are in clear violation of international law. We will continue to move forward. And even if the International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for our top officials, we will invade Rafah. What does that say? Inna Pharaohs ala fil ard, and the same thing is with Israel. They are above the law. Pharaoh did not feel accountable to anybody. Pharaoh did not care about international law or even the laws of, no, it's his law. And everyone has to yield and submit. Number 4, the fourth similarity between the Pharaoni rule and the modern state of Israel is the use of magicians and distractions. If you look at Pharaoh, what does he do? An integral part of the Pharaoni system are who? The Sahara, the magicians. Now, what role do the magicians play in Pharaoh's government? One of the most important roles that they play is they entertain the people. Because if you want to remain in power, you have to ensure that your people are enjoying themselves, they're entertained. And it also serves as a distraction from the persecution of the Hebrews. It's a distraction. You know, look at this shiny object. Don't pay attention to what I'm doing to the Hebrews. Look at the shiny object. It's a distraction. And what you find is that the same tactic is employed by the state of Israel. Since its inception, it has invested heavily in public relations campaigns and media outreach. Going back to the 50s and 60s, they would invite Hollywood actors. They would invite Sammy Davis Jr. They would invite Barbra Streisand. They'll invite the most famous singers. They'll invite Jerry Seinfeld. They'll hold sporting competitions. They'll have the Eurovision Song Contest. All of this is to do what? To show that, look how much fun people have in Israel. They'll bring in the best UFC fighters. All of this so everyone can focus on the entertainment and the show and be distracted from the grotesque human rights violations. It's the same strategy. It's a replication of the Pharaoni model. But what's interesting is that when you look at the story of Pharaoh, the magicians at least some of them, they eventually opened their eyes. And this is what we see today in the world. Some of those who were wooed by Israel, who actually believed their lies, now some celebrities are turning on them and they are advocating for Palestinian liberation. This is number 4. Number 5, and the final one that I'll share with you, is that Pharaoh used to always blame the misfortunes of ancient Egypt on Musa and his followers. If you look at the Quran, if you look at Surah Al-A'raf, Surah 7, Ayah 131, Allah says, فَإِذَا جَاءَتْهُمُ الْحَسَنَةِ. If something good happens in ancient Egypt, قَالُوا لَنَا هَذِهِ. They attribute it to themselves. They give themselves credit. وَإِن تُصِبْهُمْ سَيِّئَةٌ يَطَّيَّرُوا بِمُوسَى وَمَن مَّعَهُ. If any affliction strikes them, if any misfortune occurs, they blame it on Musa and his followers. You are the cause of our suffering. You are the reason why we are not prospering. So what does Pharaoh do whenever there is an economic crisis? Whenever there is any instability, he scapegoats Musa and his followers. To do what? Why does he do that? For 2 reasons. If you can convince your people that the source of your misery is this entity, you can unite your people. You portray for them an external enemy. That's why presidents and prime ministers, during times of difficulty, if they feel like their influence is waning, they will try to create a boogeyman. So everyone diverts their attention and their frustration at the declared public enemy. And number 2, by blaming Musa and his followers for all of the misfortunes in ancient Egypt, he's also diverting attention from his own failures. From his own failures. And this is precisely what we see in Israel today. The state of Israel will almost always attribute its security challenges and other misfortunes to the presence of these unruly Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank. No, we have to create these barriers. We need to create an open air prison, because if we don't, these people are going to ruin the stability of the country. They're going to jeopardize prosperity for everybody. So they portray the Palestinian as a threat to security, a threat to prosperity, and this allows them to justify their military excursions. It allows them to justify the barriers that they build, and it allows them to justify their open air prisons and the torture of Palestinians. You see, brothers and sisters, you see how history repeats itself. How this group of people, instead of being inspired by Musa, they were inspired by Pharaoh. They brought the rule of Pharaoh to the modern world. But there is a message of hope. And what is the message of hope? You see, brothers and sisters, when you read the story of Pharaoh in the Quran, what you notice is a couple of things. Number 1, he fell at the height of his power. If you were to tell Pharaoh, do you think that this Musa, who's a shepherd, and these Hebrews, you think that they're going to cause your downfall? He would have said, no way. I'm a superpower. And Musa is just a shepherd with these weak people. And secondly, the sea that Pharaoh drowned in, it was the source of his economic strength. Because you need water. You know, if you look at any empire and civilization, they always build near water because they need it for irrigation, for agriculture, for fishing. So his entire economy relies on the sea. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the thing that he perceives as the source of his strength to be the cause of his destruction. And then if you look at the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us something else. In Surah Al-A'raf, ayah 34, Allah says, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَجَلٍ. Allah says every nation has a specific term. In the same way that you as a human being, you have a lifespan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that in the same way that individuals have lifespans, nations and civilizations also have lifespans. فَإِذَا جَاءَ أَجَلُهُمْ لَا يَسْتَأْخِرُونَ سَاعَةً وَلَا يَسْتَقْدِمُونَ. When the time comes, when the expiration date comes for a nation, Allah says it cannot be delayed. It cannot be delayed. And there is nothing that expedites the fall of an empire faster than dhulm. If you look at Bani Umayyah, you know, usually you would think that the Umayyads, with all of their money and all of their power, you would think that they would have lasted much longer than they did, because empires usually last for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. But Bani Umayyah could not even last 1 century. Why? Because when you spill the blood of the grandson of the Prophet, Allah will speed up your destruction. And hence, a regime that spills the blood of innocent children, a regime that has no problem with decapitated children, a regime that has no problem bombing hospitals and leaving babies in the nurseries to die of starvation and to rot in the nurseries. Their time is going to come. Not because I say, because this is the law of God. This is the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And my dear brothers and sisters, as we reflect on the story of Pharaoh and the story of Bani Israel and the story of Bani Umayyah and the story of Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, we have to make a decision. Are we the people who are going to promote human liberation, or are we the aiders and those who are complicit with the oppressors? We have to make a choice. Not just as individuals, but as a society, collectively. On this night, we remember the martyrdom of a child, a young boy. A boy who was a reflection of his father, Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba, al-Qasim. This incredible young boy. You know, brothers and sisters, Al-Qasim was very young when he lost his father. He was maybe 2 or 3 years old when Imam al-Mujtaba departed this world. Which means what? Which means that, yes, Imam al-Husayn is technically his uncle, but Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam played the role of his father. On the eve of Ashura, in the days leading up to the 10th of Muharram, you can only imagine what Imam al-Husayn was thinking when he saw this young boy. Whenever he looked at him, he would remember his brother Imam al-Mujtaba. And he was probably even more protective over his nephew than his own sons, out of respect for Imam al-Hasan. So one night, it is narrated that he calls upon al-Qasim. Imam al-Husayn knows that 10th of Muharram, Ashura, is death for everybody. How do you talk to a child about death? How do you gauge them to see if they understand what lies ahead? Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he says, Bunay Qasim, come to me. He sits beside his uncle. And I want you as a father, as an uncle, to imagine that you had to have a conversation with your son or with your nephew about death. Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he looks at him and he says, Bunay Qasim, كيف الموت عندك? What is your opinion about death? What do you think about death? This young boy, he looks at Imam al-Husayn. He looks at his uncle without a moment of hesitation. He says, Ya am, fi nusratika ahla min al-asal. He says, oh my uncle Husayn, to be killed, to die alongside you, it is sweeter to me than honey. Look at the consciousness. Look at the piety. Look at the nobility. A young man, 13 years old, maximum 16 years old, to have this vision, to have this piety, to have this certainty. Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, even though he knew that Al-Qasim was willing and ready to sacrifice himself, Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam was so reluctant to give him permission. Every martyr that fell on the day of Ashura broke the heart of Imam al-Husayn. Every cry was cutting up the heart of Imam al-Husayn. When Al-Qasim on the day of Ashura, after all of the adults were killed, after Ali al-Akbar was martyred, after all of the ashab have been butchered, after Al-Abbas alayhi salam has been martyred, no, there's no more adults. So Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he stood by himself and he called out, ألا هل من ناصر ينصرنا ألا هل من ذاب يذب عن حرم رسول الله. Is there anyone who can help us? Is there anyone out there to support us? At that moment, because the adults were gone, the children came out of the tents and said, لبيك أبا عبد الله. And one of them was Al-Qasim alayhi salam. He comes to his uncle Imam al-Husayn. He says, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah. Everyone is gone. I want to join them. Give me permission. Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam refused. How could he see? Imam al-Husayn has witnessed enough death. How can he bear to see his nephew get killed in front of him? He says, my nephew, no. I cannot bear to see you get killed in front of me. I'm your uncle, I'm your protector. How can I see you get killed in front of me? Al-Qasim, he goes into his tent and he retrieves a letter, a written statement. And he goes back to his uncle Imam al-Husayn. And he hands the letter to his uncle and he says, Sayyidi Aba Abdullah. Oh my uncle Husayn, هذه وصية أبي الحسن. This is the written will of my father, Imam al-Hasan. Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, he opens up the letter and he can recognize the handwriting of his brother, Imam al-Mujtaba. In the letter, Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam addresses his son Qasim. He writes, Bunay Qasim, O my beloved son Qasim, إذا رأيت عمك الحسين وحيدا فريدا. Oh my son Qasim, if there ever comes a day when you see your uncle Husayn standing by himself without any supporters, فلا تقصر عن نصرته. Do not fall short in supporting your uncle Husayn. The narrations say that he closes the letter and he embraces his nephew. Some traditions say that Imam al-Husayn fainted after hugging al-Qasim. This is the only time on the day of Karbala that the Imam faints. It felt as though he was going to witness the second martyrdom of his brother Al-Hasan. The Imam alayhi salam, he gives him permission to enter the battlefield, but Al-Qasim now has to put on his armor. But the problem is, how do you put adult armor on a young boy? The armor was too big for him. The Imam alayhi salam, he removes his turban. The narrations say that he takes some of the cloth from his turban and he wraps the head of Al-Qasim to be like a helmet. He then takes more cloth, he wraps it around the chest of Al-Qasim as some body armor. But as he's doing this, he's probably thinking, look at what they did to Abbas and he was wearing full armor. Look at what happened to Ali al-Akbar and he was wearing full armor. What is going to happen to this young boy? The narrations say Al-Qasim was so fierce, he was so courageous, he did not walk into the battlefield. He was so eager to fight the enemies of Allah that he sprints into the battlefield. As he's sprinting, they see this young man enter the battlefield. Everyone is asking, who is this young boy? I thought we killed all of Husayn's fighters. And this is when he hears them asking, who is he? قال إن تنكروني فأنا نجل الحسن سبط النبي المصطفى والمؤتمن هذا حسين كالأسير المرتهن بين أناس لاصقوا صوب المزن. He fights courageously. He kills a number of the enemies. The narrations say, as he's fighting, there is a moment in the battle when his sandal snapped. فانقطع شسع نعله. He bends down to repair his sandal, and one of the enemies, ya mu'mineen, he strikes the head of Al-Qasim. رحم الله من نادى وقاسما ومظلوما وسيدا. As he falls to the ground, he is wounded. He cries, "Oh Husayn, oh my uncle Husayn, come to me. Aba Abdullah, adrikni." Imam al-Husayn, he rushes to the battlefield. He rushes to Al-Qasim. He sees that he's heavily injured. He's mortally wounded. He cradles his nephew in his arms. And the Imam alayhi salam begins to cry. And he says to him, يَعُزُّ عَلَىٰ عَمِّكَ أَن تَدْعُوهُ فَلَا يُجِيبُكَ. أو يجيبك فلا يعينك أو يعينك فلا يغني عنك. It pains your uncle Husayn that his nephew calls him and he is not able to help him. He then looks at the army of Umar ibn Sa'd and he says, بُعْدًا لِقَوْمٍ قَتَلُوكَ. May Allah do away with those who have killed you. وَخَصْمِهِمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ جَدُّكَ وَأَبُوكَ. And may the ones who take them to account on the day of judgment for this crime, may Rasulullah and your father stand before Allah and argue for you on the day of Qiyamah. They then, Imam al-Husayn alayhi salam, they bring the body of Al-Qasim, and there's a very painful moment. They take the body of Al-Qasim back to the tents. Where do they place him? They take him to the tent and they place him beside the body of Ali al-Akbar. Allahu Akbar. What happens next? Sayyida Zainab